So here we are, Meet Your Farmer. And so Farmer Mike is from Red Deer. His farm is called Steel Pony Farms. And we are super curious about how'd you get in? You're a young guy. What's your story? How did you get into farming?
Well, thanks for calling me young. Uh, yeah, I feel like I've had a really exciting, interesting journey to get into agriculture. Um, Growing up, I had an uncle who had a mixed kind of cattle grain farm, and I wasn't really that interested. My little brother, he was the one who would like put on chaps and put on a cowboy hat, and like he always wanted to be a farmer when he grew up. And I was never interested. But I started thinking just more and more about like food and where food came from when I was probably about 17 or 18. At the time, I didn't know really anything about like sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture, or regenerative. And so the only thing that really made sense to me was just to become like vegetarian and then vegan. Um, and so I kind of through this like series of events, I ended up in Kenya, and I was talking with this family, really rural setting, sitting around basically a little cook fire, and they asked me through our translator, they're like, "Tell us about your farm." And I just told them I don't have a farm. I live in the city, and they were just like, they're really confused because they didn't know like anything about a life without a farm. Like all of them lived right off the land, and they had like a, a home garden and then like a bigger garden that they'd have to walk to away in the field. Um, so I told them I didn't have a garden, and they're like, "What? Like, where do you get your food from?" So I told them, "Well, I get my food from the grocery store." And they're like, "Oh, okay. Well, tell us about the grocery store's farm." And it was just like such a strange moment for me. Like, I mean, I've told this story 1,000 times, but it's like my life just like pivoted at that moment where I realized like how, I guess, like entrenched or ingrained their lifestyle was of producing food and eating it, and how dissociated I was from anything related to food production. Because my answer to them was, well, I have no idea where the grocery store's farm is or what it's about. I know the food that we eat, it's shipped in from China and Mexico and California and basically all over the world. And so they were like really shocked about that. It didn't make any sense to them why we would be shipping for the world. And then upon reflection later that night by myself, I was like, well, doesn't make any sense to me why we're shipping food all over the world either. Um, and so that began this process of kind of sinking into agriculture. So basically, I committed to myself that night. I'm like, when I go back to Canada, I had one more year left in an undergrad degree in literature. So I committed that after that year, I was going to spend some time on farms and like just generally just see what would happen. So I ended up I kind of did a few different cycle trips, like bicycle trips through Western Canada and then Eastern Canada. And then actually eventually through Alberta, where I would cycle to farms and I would stop and I would volunteer for, I mean, between a day and a month. Um, and I got a really broad exposure to a lot of different types of farming. They're like cattle farms, chicken farms, a place that was raising yaks, vegetables, um, just a real diversity of things. And I started to realize slowly, like, whoa, I love this lifestyle. This is so awesome. And just having a chance to like have dinner with all these different farmers so many times and really talk about agriculture and really talk about like what food is, what it represents in our society, that like generally we're so disconnected. Um, I don't know. I just put together all these little pieces, and I just realized like, whoa, the most meaningful thing that I can do is to figure out a way to raise nutrient dense food that I share with my community that kind of acts as this like little probiotic of something positive and good that I can seed out into the world, and with the intention and the hope that that'll create health and wellness in the broader world, even outside of agriculture. So yeah, I think that, that's my path into it all.
Brilliant. And your farm name, Steel Pony, does that have something to do with you biking around the countryside?
Yeah, so being in Kenya, when I kind of had this seed initially planted, and then I had a literature degree that I did, as I mentioned, and I studied a lot of post-colonial literature, and I learned that in Kenya and different parts of Africa, when white people first arrived, they had bikes, and the natives in Africa had never seen these before, and they called them iron horses. And so because I did so much on my bike, like cycling around from farm to farm, uh, I thought Iron Horse was a cool name, but that's pretty rough and tumble, and I don't really feel that's like an inviting name as much as Steel Pony is like softer and more accessible. And then my first year or year and a half of farming, the farmland that I was leasing was quite close to Red Deer, probably like 2 miles away. And so I built these big long trailers and cycled all of my produce into town. And that was sweet. It was like a very high ideal to hold, to not use fossil fuel. And I realized as the years went by that there's other ideals that I would rather hold. Like basically all of my lofty goals and values, I just can't. Maybe it's a self-limiting belief, but at this moment in my life, I don't know how to reach all of those. And the one thing I really don't want to compromise on is like I never want to use synthetic chemicals on my farm. And so it's not like it was necessarily an either or choice, but I was like, okay, one way to save myself a ton of labor is to buy a truck and stop cycling into town. And so that was the path I took. So yeah, anyways, I was well rooted in that idea of using a bicycle. And so that's where the name came from. I've thought about changing it a number of times because everybody, I tell them Steel Pony Farm, and they're like, "Oh, do you raise ponies? You're like a horse farmer?" And I mean, legitimately so, right? Like, I understand why they would think that. And so I put a poll out on social media a few times, and I was like, "Man, this name just doesn't really fit anymore." And everybody's like, "Stay true to your roots." I love the name. Like, it'd be weird to do a rebrand 10 years into a business, I think.
Yeah.
I like it. It feels good.
It does feel good. I like it too. So you mentioned a little bit about nutrient dense food. Typically the second question we ask is a little bit about what do you grow? How do you grow? And so I'm curious about what you mean by kind of seeding this health out into the ecosystem. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. I mean, there's all these kind of tropes or sayings or just things in society that are repeated lots. And I mean, you are what you eat really is one of them. And I always think that like a cliche is a cliche for a reason. And I mean, cellularly, or even smaller than that, like chemically, atomically, we literally are what we eat. And I mean, there's like an esoteric view to this, and I feel like maybe 15 or 20 years ago, that would have been like the only explanation is to say like, oh, this food has good energy, so you eat it and now you have good energy. But more and more, I think science is catching up, and science is saying, well, no, actually, like you can even, and it's like I can't reference studies here. This is just like I could reference a few books that would start people down a rabbit hole, but basically, it's like when that, like the soil as an organism, when all of those components are together and functioning really highly, you're creating food that like it has different components to it than food that wouldn't be doing that. And so maybe the best example would be like plant secondary metabolites, which increasingly are being shown to have like all these impacts, like positive impacts on human health. And you only start to produce plant secondary metabolites when the plant is like photosynthesizing at a super high rate, because all of those base components for it to be like a healthy individual are being met through the soil ecology. So then you start to get these plant secondary metabolites, and then when human beings eat these plants that are rich in secondary metabolites, we start to really thrive too. And so if we've got like, I forgot to turn my phone off, you guys, so silly. If we don't really even know, I don't think there's anybody who actually has a diet that would be consistently rich in foods containing high levels of plant secondary metabolites. And I don't know of any studies yet that exist that say like, here's the health impacts of it. But there's like research pointing towards that. It's almost to me like a holy grail, because there's all these other things too. It's like, so, okay, if you have a diet rich in plants that are like extremely healthy, but you're also drinking alcohol regularly and eating a ton of sugar and eating a ton of other things that disrupt your gut microbiome, maybe that's kind of canceling out some of those impacts. So, I mean, I'm just curious, but I've noticed in my life, like since I've started to really focus on like a super, super clean diet and a lot of plants like from my garden, there is, I mean, to say in like the esoteric way, I've got a vibration that feels higher. And it's like, I used to hate that language 3 years ago. I'd be like, I mean, it just doesn't mean anything to me. It's super flaky. But now that I feel it, I'm like, whoa, like my head's more clear. I'm more positive. I'm more able to like manage more in my life. I want everybody to feel how I feel, basically, because it's positive and it's loving. And I think if I have to say, why is this happening to me? Why do I feel like I'm on this like upwards trajectory? I think it's because I'm blessing the soil, literally, and then asking to share in the grace of the land when I'm harvesting, and eating that food really with a ton of awareness, where I'm stopping and I'm thinking, okay, why am I eating right now? I'm eating because just like these plants, I'm an organism that I want to basically photosynthesize at my highest possible level. And for me to do that the very best so that I can produce like the human version of plant secondary metabolites, I need to make sure that my roots are reaching deep and that I'm taking in all of the necessary components in order to basically hit like the apex of that pyramid for my own development and growth. It's a ramble. Holy.
That is spectacular, Mike. Yeah, just, I mean, I've never really thought about human, whatever our secondary metabolites would be. But I mean, I think you do hit on it, love, kindness, empathy. This is the world that many of us are hoping to see and are working hard to kind of create. And yeah, I love how you've put that together. It's reminding, so Mike and I did a trip to a regenerative farming conference in the States, and there's a brilliant guy there doing some amazing work called John Kempf. And he was talking a lot about the SAD diet, the standard American diet, and how that actually, he tries to stay away from it in order to keep his mind as sharp as he can, because he feels like he's like quasi genius trying to solve some very complex problems in the world. Do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I feel like there's this, I've got a small baby in my house who's crying in the background. I don't know if you can hear it. I hope it's not a distraction, but I I mean, it's just so funny. Like, gosh, getting into the plant world and really starting to develop an appreciation for biology, I see that there's no way ever that we're gonna like crack that nut and figure out what's actually going on. And all these soil scientists who really get into this, they say that like the cosmos beneath our feet like absolutely dwarf the cosmos up in the sky. And so if you think about like how much energy and research has been put into understanding like universal cosmos, like all the planets and all those cycles, it's a lot like compared
Mhm.
to what has actually been studied down in the soil. And so like who really knows what kind of intelligence is held in this community that is like 3.5 billion years old, right? Like these organisms, they're like ancient beyond a way that we even have the capacity to understand. It's like me with like my memory of 36 years, or I mean, I don't remember every moment from when I was born, but but it's like 36 years compared to like 3.5 billion years when science says that maybe the first organisms were around, and those species by and large are still on Earth, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, they have these like we think of like whatever iPhone 10 or iPhone 11. This is like the 11th iteration of an iPhone. Some of those species are reproducing every 20 minutes. And so they've been doing that for 3 billion years. They're on like whatever bacteria, like 100 billion by now or more, right? Like, so who knows what the synthesis of all of that could actually be. And so it's like, yeah, John Kemp eating healthy, it could raise his IQ, right? Like I don't again, it's like I don't have a scientific paper to point you to that says this is true, but to think that we know that's not true, in my opinion, it's just pure hubris, right? It's like, oh no, science hasn't been able to measure this one, so it's not true. But I think what I was trying to say kind of at the beginning of this little response was that like I keep referencing like this esoteric world, but as time goes on, all these things that we thought were esoteric are being proven by science. And so I feel it's like, okay, there's, the weirdos that like believe, I don't know, just something about food or spirituality or like the connection. A great one would be the mycelium network, right? The arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. I mean, that's a pretty new discovery. I think it's like within 25 years. It literally shows how plants talk to each other and they share nutrients and they like some of you obviously I think know this, that like a mother tree can direct nutrients specifically to her seedlings as opposed to like seedlings that are right there but don't come from her, and it goes through the that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And it's like that's exactly like the movie Avatar, right? And this was like a sci-fi idea basically that nobody really believed, and now basically any scientist who's worth his or her salt says this is real, this is actually happening on Earth. And so yeah, for me, like the cutting edge of agriculture or the allure or the intrigue, um, is like that we just have no idea actually what's happening or what the upper limits of grace and beauty and regeneration on Earth are. And that we have a choice, I think, as agriculturalists, we can fall into that grace and move towards it and say like, man, I'm going to do everything I can to support this living system. Or we have an option, which is kind of more commonly the case. If I look out my window, I see a field full of canola that's Roundup ready, um, which means that you can battle against that organism, battle against nature, battle against the fungi and the bacteria. And so, yeah, it just feels great to not know what those upper limits are, but I have a really strong faith that I'll never go wrong if I'm mulching my soil with straw. You know, I'll never go wrong if I decide not to rototill. I did an internship in Quebec on a farm very similar to mine, basically, that I've modeled mine after, and they grew, oh, they probably had like 40 or 50 different crops that they grew. And it was basically like anything that they could possibly grow in their growing season, they grew. So I started off with that idea. But after a few years, I realized there were certain crops that some of them I just didn't like. Some of them I found that like the payback wasn't worth what I was putting into them. So an example would be like peas and beans. One, my farm was still relatively, I mean, just a lot smaller than it is now, about 5 or 6 years ago. I had like a small staff of like four or something like that, and we were spending like 25 hours a week picking peas and beans, and that was just way too much. So I cut peas and beans out. I've never really had a good tomato harvest, but I grew tomatoes for probably like 7 years, and so I just quit growing tomatoes. But I mean, I grow a lot of like what you'd think of as like a standard Alberta crop, like um, onions, garlic, beets, carrots. I've actually quit growing potatoes. I've grew them until this year, but John at Eagle Creek, I'm getting him to grow my potatoes this year. Um, Cabbage, broccoli, kale, collards, arugula radishes, a bunch of herbs, rosemary, thyme, sage, oregano, cilantro, dill, uh, maybe a couple others. Trying celery this year for the first time in celeriac, and they're actually looking really good. Yeah, I really like eating the brassica family. I never used to like kale, um, but and I always am suspicious of these like yoga people who are like, "Oh, kale's so good." I'm like, "Is it really good?" I don't know. But my wife and I started making massage kale salad. So we slice it up super thin, put some salt and oil on there, really, really work it. And then we have this really delicious, like a homemade Caesar dressing we make. We put it on there, and there were some weeks last year we kept track. We ate 14 bundles of kale one week. We were just obsessed. It was like every meal we were just slamming kale. So I really like that whole family, so I grow a lot of them. Kai Coker, who I believe was kind of at the genesis of YYC Growers, he's from Red Deer as well. So we're from the same hometown. And I don't think we actually met each other in Red Deer. We met in Calgary one time at a house party, probably like 15 years ago, and just connected a bit. And we just stayed in touch. And yeah, I knew he was farming. He knew I was farming. We'd hop on the phone once in a while. And then one time he just messaged me and was like, "Hey, we're looking for new members." So I basically went through the application process and got in there. And it's been really fun. It's been a cool journey for me learning from this organization and individuals like Rod, and making friendships like the friendship I have with Rod. In terms of COVID, like government support or just impacts of it, there's a few wage subsidy programs that the government has right now. And I don't know, it's like they existed before COVID, but I think that they've just had more money funneled to them as a result. And so I've got a few of those right now that I have a bit of help with wage subsidies for some of my employees. So that's been really useful and helpful. And then the main thing that I've noticed is just this massive uptick in interest for local, sustainably or organically produced food. So, like, this is, like I mentioned, my 10th year running a farm. I don't think I've ever officially sold out. Like, I always kind of set my production targets, and then my sales end up like kind of around here. And so I'm really working my tail off to reach that little gap. So I sell everything that I have. And this year I set my production targets, and then it was like sales just went like, they like overtook them. So then I reset my production targets, and then I eventually had to cap it just because I knew I shouldn't be growing anymore. I just didn't feel responsible to grow more than about I think it's like something 35 or 40% since last year. So, yeah, so I mean that's been a boon for sure. Main thing that I do is this food box program, just similar to YYC, but just based out of my own farm. Um, I think there's a lot of different advantages. Like one, and these are, I mean, it's not like necessarily the financial business advantage, but it's been really great for me just solidifying these connections with other farmers. And think just expanding my perspective on what farming means in my context. Like, I think it's a really good thing for me that I'm buying potatoes from John this year, and it's really good for him too. Um, and so it means he can do something like he grows potatoes better than I do. He grows like, I don't know, one year he said he had 300 tons of potatoes, I think was his harvest, like something like that. Don't quote me, but like I maybe grow like 3 or 4 tons of potatoes at most. And so it's just good to get him doing something he's good at so I can focus on things that I'm good at. And yeah, connections like that I've built through YYC Growers. There's sometimes where I have a real excess of crops, and typically I wouldn't know what to do with those. I'd call a bunch of restaurants or grocery stores, and they might buy like 20 or 30, 40 units at a time. But YYC Growers will buy like 2 or 3 or 400 units at a time. And so it just really helps me consolidate my marketing effort. Really helps out like that. And I think too, just seeing a co-op that's flourishing gets things cooking for me to think about like, okay, what does Red Deer need? And is there a potential for something like this to spread into Red Deer to help with getting more local food to more people? I mean, I've never valued textbook learning as much as I've valued like just getting out and doing something. And I think that there's probably no farmer ever who said no to a volunteer to come out. But there's just something about being there to like plant some kale, for example, that I think can create, at least in me, such an appreciation of what this plant really is and what the value in it is. And so whether it's specifically volunteering or just finding a way to like get onto a farm, touch some plants, touch some soil, I think it becomes hard to resist the inclination to clean up your diet and just get more involved with these local relationships if you have a chance to do that. So yeah, I would recommend just get out to a farm, call, I guess everybody can't call Rod, but call Rod, call me or someone like us, and just like figure out how to spend some time.
Well, Mike, we want to give you the final word, and just let us know what is the most satisfying thing for you about farming.
I think it's just like farming to me just feels like this process of connecting dots. And initially it was all about like soil health and that soil community. But I see now that like my ability to provide any type of leverage in a positive way towards that ecology, it's like a direct result of the connections that I have in my life. And the support that I have from my family and staff and my eaters. And so it's just like, I mean, I've heard that, well, I'm not heard because it's true. Most grasses, they're like a mirror image above the soil and below the soil. And so it's like everything we're doing below the soil can support this above the soil thing, which is the human based part. And so it's just really, yeah, it's amazing for me to have this staff out there who, I mean, my intention is to treat them the same way that I treat my soil, with love and with wholeness, and to see them for who they are and meet them where they are, and that they do the same thing for me. And then together as a staff, we're ready to take on this like monumental challenge of directing this orchestra out on 8 acres. Yeah, it's so satisfying. It's like never ending stimulation.
Beautiful. And I think, yeah, exactly what you're saying. This vital human component. I know I was not always great with my staff because I'm like, we got so much work to do. But I've planted with you, and I've seen you create that environment. And yeah, I challenge everyone on the call or anyone that if they want to see a holism around nurturing life, wellness, wholeness, love, compassion. Mike, you do it in such a beautiful and gifted way, and we are so grateful to have you. Mike is also one of our board members, and so we hope to be building more of what we've got going in with YYC Growers and what Mike's got going at Steel Pony Farms. We want to see that happen more and more in Alberta. So here.
You're here. Thanks a lot. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for having me.